Welcome to Watershed Chats. Watershed moments are traditionally understood as a division or distinction between two phases. They can be turning points that define our shared history. Here, we sit down with experts and those having a go at building and dreaming new ways into fruition for a healthy and habitable future on planet Ocean. Dr. Pia Winberg is a marine ecologist and entrepreneur. A fascination with the scientific properties of seaweed has led her to a decades-long career in both researching and implementing sustainable marine food production systems, specifically the human and ecosystemic health impacts of growing, consuming, and nurturing our relationship with seaweed. Seaweed is recognized as a potentially major ally in drawing down the carbon that fuels climate change, and for its ability to create rich marine habitat and provide substantive nutrition for humankind. Pia started and runs Australia's first commercial seaweed farm and is working to share the layered solutions from personal to global that seaweed offers. Thank you for being with us today, Pia. In your TEDx presentation in 2018, you said that from planetary surfaces to the molecules of life, we need seaweed. Why?
Well, seaweed's one of the oldest organisms on our planet, and it was a key player in creating the oxygen, taking out the carbon dioxide that dominated planet Earth millions of years ago and turned it into an oxygen-rich planet, which is essential and the basis upon which we as animals evolved. And so our wonderful oxygen-rich planet is a consequence of all plants, but predominantly seaweeds. And the types of seaweeds that we're farming and working with now are some of the oldest organisms. They predate even land plants. So these organisms are still here. They were the creation of oxygen and the Earth system as it stands today in the beginning, and they'll be vital moving forward to maintain that balance on Earth, as well as solving the challenges we're facing by human impacts trying to shift that balance on Earth.
I'm so happy to hear that, Pia, because I have a real love of seaweed, but I feel like I know so little about it. And I've just been reading Bren Smith's Eat Like a Fish book, and he talks a lot about his own sort of epiphanies around seaweed. How did you come to this? Like, how did you get this deep engagement with seaweed that you now have?
Well, my background was originally from Stockholm University in Sweden, where I was studying my master's at the Department of Systems Ecology. So marine global systems was what my key interest was. What is it that drives the Earth systems? How do the ocean currents work? The chemistry, the biology, the geology, and the evolution of all of that was just fascinating to me. But also the context that we're actually challenging those global systems. It's pretty amazing when you realize that the scale of human impacts on the planet now can actually challenge planetary systems and change them. And we're sort of blind to that. I mean, in a way, we became a little bit aware of that a few decades ago when the ozone depleting gases in aerosols were identified, and we actually addressed that issue, started to eliminate those gases in aerosol cans, and we achieved an improvement in the ozone layer. But I think those sorts of things, and the book like The Silent Spring and things like that, where it's only really a few decades where people have realized that at this scale, humans have the capacity to shift global systems. And for me, I was at Stockholm University seeing the explosion of aquaculture, or the Blue Revolution, which is sort of the late half of the 1900s, was such a big thing. And the World Bank was putting money out there to developing nations, Southeast Asian countries, Sri Lanka was one of them, saying that aquaculture is going to save everybody and the economy and grow food for the world. And that's true, except you've got to take into account the planetary systems that would support aquaculture and the ecosystem. And it's just like you can't put food on our table, flush it down the toilet, and then pump that toilet water back through your kitchen sink, because you've got to let it go through a regeneration process before you can drink clean water again. And that's what they were doing in aquaculture. They were, one, killing themselves, but they were also decimating the ecosystems around them that support services like seaweeds putting oxygen back in the water, taking up the nutrients, small organisms eating particles. And the World Bank just didn't, they're looking with good intentions at how to support developing nations with aquaculture, but they were all failing and miserably, which impacted these coastal communities very heavily, and which was sad for the people, but it's also extremely sad for the coastal ecosystems that were being killed. And, the coral reef is just one example, is still being heavily impacted by land-based eutrophication and nutrients coming from land-based agriculture in Queensland, but that was happening directly from aquaculture systems throughout Southeast Asia. And seaweed then, for me, I got the opportunity to travel to Sri Lanka and work on a tiger prawn farms there, amazing country, coral reefs, beautiful coastlines, fantastic advanced surfing and amazing hillsides and people. But the social challenges they were facing were huge. But one farm looked at recycling the water from the tiger prawn farms through an ecosystem, if you like, of milkfish, tilapia, mussels, and then seaweed, to really be a permaculture system that recycles and regenerates the water, and you can send it back to the prawns again. But they're all really organic, natural nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. We just need to recycle them and put them into the context of an ecosystem. I spent 10 years looking at how to use seaweed to clean up aquaculture, but then also realised nobody was actually going to pay to clean up aquaculture because there's no incentives there. And then I went, well, let's just not promote that story. Let's look at what seaweed does for humans otherwise in the world, and that the consumer will end up, we as people can fund the way forward by using seaweed as a crop in our foods, and it fills in so many nutritional gaps in the diet. Huge benefits to some of our chronic lifestyle disorders, mental health issues, diabetes, heart diseases, anemia. Brain damage is one of the biggest issues globally just through iodine deficiency, and seaweed is king of iodine supply. So we just need a bit of seaweed every day to address some of those deficiencies. And so that's what I've spent my time on in the last 10 years. So it's been a journey from sustainability through human food nutrition, and then finding a model and solution that can start to work and generate an economic system that is good for the planet and good for the people.
Wow, that's a big journey. There's a lot of experiences there.
Yeah, it's not an overnight journey. People often say, oh, can I start a seaweed farm? And you look back at 20 years and go, if you want to. But no, now, with more research, and that's the point, is we're going to try and expand and make this, the knowledge has to then now be spread and become more common, so that seaweed is part of our sustainable solution moving forward.
Just touching a little bit more deeply on the potential health benefits for humans, in Bren Smith's book, Eat Like a Fish, he writes, native seaweeds contain more vitamin C than orange juice, more calcium than milk, and more protein than soybeans. Those on the hunt for omega-3s are often surprised to learn that fish don't create these heart-healthy nutrients by themselves. They consume them. By eating the plants fish eat, we get the same benefits while reducing pressure on fish stocks. So it's high time we eat like a fish.
Yes, that's true, because our food system evolved from the ocean, and we are in tune with some of the important nutrients that primarily come from the ocean. And by not eating from the seas as much as we should, we're actually very deficient in some important ingredients that Bren Smith's listed there.
I'm curious, Pia, in your experience, how did this happen? Have we traditionally just not consumed seaweed and a variety of seaweeds? Is there a timeline that you know of that shows where we lost our way, or have we never really had a way when it comes to sea greens?
I think that it's the better or for worse, the industrialization of the food system just forgot seaweed. It just dropped it off the plate, because we picked up some technologies where food production from land became so productive and prolific and efficient. And we didn't do all food systems on the planet when that happened. And so it just got left behind, because seaweed was an ancient food from, the oldest middens in Chile in South Americas show how important seaweed was to the people there. There are ancient middens far inland full of seaweeds, and show how the diversity of seaweeds and travelling with seaweeds was very important to the peopling of the South Americas and that value in food for them. Countries in Southeast Asia where the food industrialisation was a lot slower and is sort of accelerating now, but that they've always kept up seaweed in their diets. And so some countries like Okinawa and Japan, they have like up to 10% seaweed in their diets for some people. And Vikings used to eat seaweed, and the Irish used to eat lava bread, lots of lava bread. I'm not sure that I like the lard blend with seaweed personally so much, but it was very important for their nutrition. And I guess the food revolution happened, trying to make food productive and abundant for people, but it really didn't focus on what the nutritional requirements of a human being were. And so it wasn't designed in that way. And, coming to Australia with the modern agricultural sector, that was the only, this is how we make food. We grow crops on land, and nobody looked to the ocean other than for fishing. And they sort of lost there's not a lot of seaweed to harvest in Australia as much as there is in Ireland as well. So, yeah, it just got dropped off the menu of the modern industrialisation food system. And unfortunately, we have to rediscover it again. But the opportunity in Australia as well is that there's seaweeds here that are unique to the world, and we've got an opportunity to introduce very new seaweeds to the world as well.
That's exciting.
And so you've driven a trajectory toward establishing Australia's first commercial seaweed farm. Can you talk us through what that means and why you established it?
Well, I, stayed sort of in academia for a long time, researching sustainability of seaweed, and you're standing in lecture theatres saying this is what the world should be doing, and just getting a sense of frustration. And, the ivory tower is very, very real. It actually doesn't change the world with the solutions we need fast enough. And as a researcher, you're sitting in a university, you don't get the opportunities really to take some of the research into the real world. And something like seaweed farming, it really needs the scientists and the engineers and the investors and the marketers to all be in the game together. You can't sit in a university and solve the daily problems that we have to solve. And it's the history of 20 years of me experiencing seaweed, trying to grow it this way, it just things like drying. You think that drying wouldn't be something that limits the opportunity for growth, but it seriously is. Drying was a really hard thing to do when you're standing there now with 25 tons of seaweed and it's got to be dried, and you're trying to spread it out on ovens manually. It's just very difficult. So finding the types of equipment and systems that make it practical and don't destroy the nutrients, for example, and work with the health of the seaweed. You need to be, as the scientist, involved in every step of the scaling up. And I guess that's why, 4 years ago I left university and the academic lifestyle, because it wasn't getting the outcome done, and putting skin in the game was the most effective way to do that. And at this stage, I think it is. It's not to say I might not go back to interesting research when others can carry on and operate seaweed farms without me, but it really requires commitment and a day in, day out, learning from taking up your 20 years of experiences to solving problems that turn up tomorrow, because there's a lot of technology in the seaweed, from the biology of the plants to knowing which seaweeds you can eat in what ways, because seaweeds, importantly, are not just seaweeds. They're more diverse than land plants. So it's like saying, I grow plants. This is how I do it. Well, if you grow bananas, that's very different to growing peanuts or wheat. So it's going to be more diverse than land plant production. And there's so much knowledge that has to go into that. You can imagine the knowledge that goes into growing plants. Well, people are saying, oh, I'm just going to grow seaweed as if it's one method and one thing, but it's really not. It's a whole new adventure of different species, which is daunting but exciting and an opportunity.
And it's in a much less controllable environment if you're talking about growing in the oceans, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. So you've got to be in tune with what the currents and weather patterns and that sort of thing introduce each day. And there's other animals out there that might want to eat seaweed first, for example. So you've got to work with systems like that. And there'll be, so we also grow seaweed. Both we're looking at offshore line production, which is how many species are grown, but also some species like from rock pools species are more in tune with being grown in large swimming pools on land. And that offers you an opportunity to control the inputs much more. But it also offers you, importantly, an opportunity to catch rogue nutrients that are coming from land sources that otherwise would enter the oceans uncontrolled and create an imbalance. So in our current farm, we capture carbon dioxide from distillery fermenters, as well as the digested nutrient streams from that, a little bit like I was looking at cleaning up tiger prawn aquaculture, but now I'm cleaning up nutrient streams from large distilleries. And that means we can close the loop on the processing of that food production as well. And our waste products from the seaweed pools are clean water and oxygen. And we don't have any roots or seeds or other things that are waste streams. So it's a net tying up of a food cycle in that instance.
So can you talk us through your project, your operation, your farm, where it's at the moment and where you want to take it?
And what kind of seaweed you're working with specifically too?
Yeah, so we did around 10 years ago start to look at, well, what seaweeds are there in Australia and how do you eat them? Because there was no real legacy or information about species to eat in Australia. We were importing kombu and wakame and nori from overseas, and those species mostly don't grow here. We do have our own local species of nori, which we've explored. But we have to learn, well, what are these species? What's in them? Can you eat them? And so we did some reports and reviews on that about 12 years ago. And you can see those reports on the AgriFutures Australia government website. That was through the universities. And we identified many different types, and many different types are still exciting to grow. But we ended up focusing on one particular type of green seaweed. And people were saying to us, oh, you're going to grow nori, like nori sheets. And I was going, you know what, for me to compete with Japanese and Koreans in growing and making nori sheets, I think that's going to be a big challenge, because then I've got to do it better than them. And they're decades and scales ahead of us. So it didn't really, I'm an academic, but at least that sort of business sense came across to me. And I said, I think we need to find our unique selling point here. And also there are other seaweeds like the green seaweeds that are traditional foods in Southeast Asia, but they were ones that hadn't actually taken off in terms of food production. So we found a unique species of Australian seaweed. We had to do lots of genetic barcoding. That means to tell species apart, because in the oceans, depending on the currents and the nutrients and the species, fish that are eating seaweeds, they can actually change form a little bit, even though they're the same species, or they also are different species and look very similar. So one of the only ways for us to tell a species apart was to look at a genetic marker, and that's called genetic barcoding. So we had to do a lot of screening of Australian seaweeds, and we found a green one that is uniquely Australian. And we also found that the molecules in these species were unique to each species in terms of the gut fibres in them. And so we started to explore this Australian one, and that's the one we're currently focusing on. We also found unique Australian nori species that we'd like to explore further, but they've got tricky sex lives, so it's very hard to get the mood right for them and keep that reproduction happening. So we will get back to that, but the important thing is that you get the industry established and you start moving it forward rather than solving all the pressing problems and questions that you've got up front. And so that's what we've settled on. And this one is best farmed in big rock pools that we create on land that are giant swimming pools, and we pump in seawater, carbon dioxide from a distillery, and sunlight and nutrients from that distillery. And we farm the seaweed, and that in the product of that is a dried seaweed biomass that's 50 times more productive in that area than, say, wheat crop would be. So we're able to reduce the footprint, 50 times of a given amount of food production. And that footprint's full of nutrients that we're missing in the diet otherwise. So to scale seaweed farming in Australia should be a priority for government for sustainability reasons and human health and nutrition reasons. And that's why it's important to us to have made this step of building, we still call that scale a pilot farm, build our new factory here on the South Coast and start to put the food into the markets and show that people will eat it. Because in the beginning, nobody really believed me that, when I started more than 20 years ago, sushi or nori wasn't really even on the supermarket shelves. And so people were shaking their heads. Why would you do that? And now it's about showing people, you have to show by example, and the customer and the community is what really makes the change, is that people will create the demand for a more sustainable and healthy food source. And that is the game changer. The game changer isn't standing there with an academic paper saying this is what you should do. It obviously isn't governments creating systems and incentives to change the picture. It's the people. And it was the people that started to buy solar panels and that sort of thing. And that's what we needed to start showing, is that getting the seaweed products made, testing them with people. Do you like this? I still haven't mastered seaweed ice cream, but I will get there. And then, bringing products to the masses. And it's important to bring it to everybody, not just the foodies, because foodies are great. They create the, exciting new ideas about how to use seaweeds, but there are not that many of them that them buying seaweed is going to make a big impact on the planet. We need to be feeding everybody a little bit of seaweed every day to have that sort of impact. And so what does the demographic in an urban, low socioeconomic area versus a coastal beachcomber lifestyle, and then the high-rise wealthy people in the urban centres. So, we need something for everybody, and that's what we have to try and develop and prove.
Yeah, Dave and I both are so excited about the prospect of learning more about seaweed and engaging more with seaweed in terms of a solution, a multi-layered solution for so many social and environmental issues. I first became aware of seaweed as an outlet for a solutions-based view on climate, particularly through Damon Gameau's book and film 2040. And in his companion book, Damon wrote, "This one solution could potentially draw down staggering amounts of carbon, restore marine ecosystems, provide enough seafood, brimming with healthy omega-3 fatty acids, for 10 billion people, cool the waters over coral reefs to help prevent bleaching, plus provide a material to make plastics and clothing, feed cattle, dramatically reduce methane emissions, and provide a biofuel for energy." I mean, that's a lot of layers of solutions coming from one plant.
And that's just some of them. Reversing ocean acidification is another one that actually happens when you farm seaweeds. So there are so many opportunities. But it's not sort of magic when you think about it, because as I mentioned before, and you look back on where seaweed came from, it actually created the oxygen in our atmosphere. It changed planet Earth in the beginning, and it was the foundation for plants coming up onto land and then animals following that. So seaweed is one of the original creators of life and the systems on this planet. And so to solve some of the issues that we are facing, seaweed is going to have to be a central part of it. I get pretty frustrated when you hear about engineers saying that we're going to cool the planet by shielding the sun. Was like, well, that's a very engineer solution, because you're then blocking out the light that creates photosynthesis that takes up the carbon dioxide in the first place. So we have to look at the systems that created planet Earth's life to being part of the big solution that will solve them. And then you realize the scale and the power of seaweed on planet Earth. And one example was just the Beijing Olympics, where seaweed actually stopped the whole sailing event because there was a deep ocean upwelling, and suddenly there were 2 meters thick seaweed on the whole Bay Area that nobody could get through. And so that is the power of seaweed. And the exciting thing with seaweed compared to the microalgae is that once that upwelling's happened and the seaweed's grown and it's trapped all the nutrients, then when it runs out of the nutrients, it suddenly gets heavy. And that seaweed sinks hard and fast to the bottom of the ocean. And then it creates that storage of carbon down the bottom very rapidly. And there's not many cycles on the planet that can draw down carbon at that scale and at that pace. And indeed, many of the tar deposits that we make our roads from have signatures that indicate that a lot of the tar is probably fossil seaweed from way back then that we're now paving our roads with. So I like to call them highways of seaweed, but it just illustrates the scale and the power of seaweeds and algae to create the planetary systems that we need to survive ourselves. And even the White Cliffs of Dover that you can see from air flights, and if you go surfing up in the colder climes, though those are actually cliffs made entirely of small algae. And then you sort of think, wow, that seaweeds and algae are such a fundamental part of the whole life chain on Earth. And we really haven't appreciated that. And that's the message that we've got to try and get out there. So those claims are not extraordinary in any way. They are real claims about what seaweed can do.
So knowing all of that then, Pia, what's stopping us right now? Like, how is it that you are, the first in your field here in Australia doing this? How is it that each of the river systems in the areas like where we live on the great northern rivers in New South Wales, why don't we have people growing here? Why isn't this everywhere now that we know what we know?
I think the first barrier is, or has been, and now suddenly it's unlocking, and as I said, I've been doing this for 22 years, so it's not an overnight story for me, but for many people it's like, oh, we've suddenly discovered seaweed. And it was just really hard for me to even get people to understand that you can eat seaweed and you can farm seaweed. I had the opportunity to go to Sri Lanka to discover this problem and a way that the tiger prawn farms could be made more sustainable and that seaweed was key. And then an opportunity to take that with me and get to do a decade or two of research in universities to take that idea further. But then to stand there and tell people, like down here on the south coast where I live, beautiful coastline, it's ideal. We have beautiful national forest catchments, so the coastal waters are very clean. It's the perfect place to look at growing seaweed. But you go to council, which is dominated by an older male generation, and tell them to start eating seaweed instead of meat and 3 veg is a bit challenging. It's honestly a huge barrier. They're scratching their heads and looking at you like you're some weird hippie from outer space. and really that's the response you get. You're not taken seriously in the beginning. But now, slowly, just by doing it, just by making it, just by selling it, people going, it is something. And so that's step one. Now people really understand that seaweed is an opportunity. I think we still have governments and industry investment groups who, think it's still a nice cottage industry story for a local community, but it's not. It's a national and it's a global solution. And once that's taken seriously, then the next step is we need more people who understand the different species, the ways we can grow it, the infrastructure that's needed, and people that we train to be employed on seaweed farms, and then the food industry. So we've become a whole vertical chain in our business because the vertical chain wasn't there. We were first farming it and going like, well, now the food industry will buy it, but the food industry didn't know what to do with it. So then we went, we'll have to show them. So we then put it in the pasta and go, you just put it in pasta and then you eat it. It's that simple. And now the food industry is starting to go, but there are also seaweeds that are very rich in things like iodine, and you do have to know which species you can dose into foods like pasta at high levels. So kombu, for example, is a great seaweed for iodine supplementation, but you only need a sprinkle a day, if that, any more, and you'll overdose your iodine big time. And it actually did happen to a food company in Australia, and they made people very sick, not by ill intent, just because they didn't know. So this is the type of knowledge we need to start spreading and informing people so that we learn how to eat seaweeds again. And then we slowly have to get the broader market to buy it and pick it up, because that's the only way that the success of the industry will move forward. So I think we're well on the way to step one, in that the message is pretty much getting out there. And through podcasts like this, it's fantastic that we're all part of sharing the opportunity and the story together. And now we need to start creating species, places, and businesses that can take it to the next level.
There's such beauty in the kind of metaphor of using algae or using seaweed as a solution, looking at the very small and how the smallest organisms can have the most incredible global impact. And I was also thinking about, in terms of this, the problem of a global industrial food system that we've created, in terms of bringing that home and localizing engagement with something like seaweed. What can you recommend for people who want to start experimenting with seaweed, possibly foraging seaweed? Are there rules and regulations here in Australia for that?
Yeah, it's great if people start to experiment themselves with what can they do with their local seaweeds, because as I mentioned before, Australia has got some pretty unique species. They're as unique as our gum trees and koalas and kangaroos on land are in a global context. And we have areas of super high diversity, like here in Jervis Bay, there's an enormous diversity of seaweeds. And other places like South Australia, similar diversity, but there's also abundance there because there's deep water current upwelling, and that creates more biomass. So there's different species and there's different amounts on different coastlines all around Australia. And we stretch from the tropics, where the crocodiles are, down to Tasmania, where marine life is very different. And so understanding and learning about each of the different seaweeds and how to use them will be a fantastic thing for people to start looking at locally, and sharing, because sharing that knowledge will be part of finding the unique species, the opportunities there are to farm it in different locations, because we also want to do a seaweed industry development very sustainably and in tune with the coastal zone and marine environment in full. And that means, importantly, not translocating and introducing species of seaweed. So no matter how good seaweed is for the planet, you don't want to be introducing another cane toad type species or like many plant pests that we have. And that actually has happened where they've translocated seaweeds from Southeast Asia in the Philippines to African countries. And some of these species have become pests. So we need to be looking at our local species, and people, by trying them out, and I do get called often. I don't have time to take all calls, but people ask me, can you eat this seaweed? And there will be a book coming out soon, I hope, from some researchers at Deakin University to show a little bit more about which species in Australia could be eaten and how. And you are allowed in each state, under its own regulations, to take small amounts of seaweed, mostly from the beach. So you're not really allowed to cut any seaweeds for your own use from the rocks, unless it's the green seaweeds that people tend to use for fish bait. You're really limited to picking up seaweed from the beach. In New South Wales, that's 20 kilos a day for personal use. And so if you're going to eat it, you want to make sure it's a nice, fresh, washed up piece of seaweed. Otherwise, you can take partially degraded ones, and they're fantastic to put in your compost then, and to start feeding your plants as well, because the nutrition from seaweeds will go through the whole food chain and back to you eventually. So that's what people can do locally, is to start finding their own local species, testing them out. But we do need to grow the industry in terms of farming, because we recognise that wild harvest of seaweeds will be like wild harvest of fish, and we can overdo it. And even in the US, where there is actually a wild harvest of seaweeds on the northeast coast, they're already starting to have ecological impacts by over-harvesting seaweeds. And so cultivation is the best way that we can increase the productivity of seaweeds without damaging the coastal ecosystems that really need the seaweeds there.
That's such an important point. It's so easy to romanticize wild harvest and growing your own, but there are so many of us now that at some point we have to think about efficiency in food production. And it's so fantastic that you're thinking about building this emerging industry with those principles in mind of sustainability and respecting ecosystems. Is there a history of Indigenous Australians consuming seaweed?
Yes, but it's quite hidden, and like many traditions in their food, very sadly, the information has also been lost. But I've been lucky here in Jervis Bay, for example, to meet some of the local aunties, and their wise words to me has been, "Oh yeah, that green seaweed, we take that for a good gut." And you're like, wow, it took me like 3 clinical studies and years of research to prove that point. And there you go. But that's the way we have to do it in the modern world. But it's not well documented. It's not written down. And so there is a research group at Deakin University in Victoria looking a little bit more at documenting some of the historic use of seaweed in foods in Australia. But I often like to show an image from Tasmania that Australians were the first real seaweed users, because there's some beautiful artifacts from the Tasmanian bull kelps. So they're really thick, leathery seaweeds down there, and that they used to dry them and sew them together as water carriers. And they look like these amazing, beautiful leather articles, but it's seaweed. And that's what they did in Tasmania. And some of the records of these findings are close to 40,000 years old. So that is one of the oldest forms of seaweed use on the planet that is recorded, and that is from our own Australian history.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, I guess the story that I feel emerging from your story is that as we've moved into more human spaces, away from the oceans and toward a more land-based existence, we've seen the health and the cultural and the ecological impact of that switch. And just now with your work and others' work around seaweed, we're seeing the very deep and interwoven connection to the oceans that we actually have to rediscover if we're going to keep our planet habitable. We have to reconnect with those watery roots.
That's absolutely the case. And the Maoris, for example, in New Zealand, they still use seaweed as one of their old foods. And actually during the World Wars, the Maori battalion was packed nori from the coastal line in New Zealand as part of their rations and food that was essential in sustaining them in war. Not that I'm promoting war here, but it just illustrates the importance of that nutritional source for the Maori culture. And I look forward to the day when the Australian Army gets dispatched from the Jervis Bay bases here with satchels of seaweed to sustain them. We would rather not have the conflict on planet Earth, but it will be probably a healthier society, including our military personnel, if they are armed with seaweed in their satchels.
Or maybe they could just stay home and be seaweed farmers instead.
Exactly. Well, some of the research we've done, humans and conflict have been a part of our evolution over time, and we really would like to avoid and reduce that level of conflict. But in part, nutrition is actually important. We have done one clinical study here on the South Coast in prisons where we know that the long-chain marine omega-3s are important for our heart health, things like DHA and EPA, and people mostly know that as fish oil. But as Bren Smith stated earlier, the fish oil came from the seaweeds and algae. It was only accumulated in the fish through the food chain. And the organisms that create those omega-3s at the molecular level are seaweeds and algae. And we're very deficient in these nutrients. And they're very important for brain health. And the grey matter at the front of our brain is actually very highly represented with DHA omega-3 from the ocean if we eat correctly. And that's important because that's a part of our brain that's firing signals all the time. And these molecules are very important for our cells to be able to fire signals. And if we're not eating those omega-3 oils, we put other oils in place of that. And it actually inhibits the senses and signaling of the cells in our brain. And so it's, again, not rocket science and not science fiction, really, to say that seaweed could be implemented to reduce aggression and impulsive behaviour, which is what we actually looked at in a prison. And that was following a study at Oxford University where they reduced aggressive incidents in a prison by 35% by supplementing the prisoners with fish oil.
Wow.
So we did a study in Nowra here on the south coast and showed that omega-3 in prisoners was negatively correlated. That means that, not much omega-3 in their blood and they were more aggressive. If they had more omega-3 in their blood, then they were less aggressive. And we published that work a number of years ago. And now that's a multi-centre trial hosted at the University of Wollongong using algal omega-3 to look at the aggressive and impulsive behaviours in prisoners. So maybe we can achieve world peace by eating more seaweed and algae.
That sounds fantastic. Oh my gosh. Can you talk a little bit more about the medicinal applications of specifically the slime of seaweed that I've heard you talk a little bit about?
Yes, it's very exciting that the connective tissue in seaweeds is actually very similar to the connective tissue in animals and humans, because distinct from plants, they're in a salty environment and they don't need all of these cellulose and lignin hard fibers to fight gravity because they're supported by the ocean. And really it's about the flexibility in a salty environment and fighting off viruses and bacteria in the oceans, and communicating with the good bacteria on the surface of the seaweeds, which is really the microbiome or the gut environment of the seaweed. And so some of the biological similarities of the molecules in seaweed with the molecules in human tissues is astounding. And we found in some particular species that we nearly exactly mimic the molecules in human skin. And so some of our research now is all about extracting these molecules from particular seaweeds, purifying them and turning them into an ink that we can print with human cells and recreate human tissue. And we're inspired in this work a lot by Professor Fiona Wood in Western Australia, who treats some of the serious burns victims, tragic events that often happen to young children, scalding burns, but we even heard about the horrific volcano burns from New Zealand and how they were importing human skin from the US to try and treat these people. And Fiona Wood developed a skin spray to put onto burns, and these human skin cells that she sprays on tissue, and burnt tissue can actually start to grow themselves and recreate skin. But because the cells don't have any structure to develop on, they're just sort of sprayed and land in little clusters, they don't create in the end necessarily a very functional tissue. It saves a life, but the person struggles hard with a lifetime of scarring. And if they're children, it's very hard to grow with that sort of skin. So we're looking at the opportunity for down the future having a skin ink that's made from seaweed extract, which you could spray your own skin cells onto, and to help create a more functional repair of the skin layers and heal humans from the outside in that way. But that's not also, it's also linked to the gut, because the gut is also a special type of skin, and the types of molecules and mucus that line our gut and essential for our gut health are also nearly exactly the same molecules that I'm talking about here. So that's where it's healing from the inside and from the outside. Seaweed's got a whole future of opportunity ahead of it.
If people want to learn more, if they want to engage with your work or support seaweed farming and cultivation, how can they do that?
I would say that the very first thing to do is a little bit like, I said with the solar panel and sustainability industries, is for your own health and for the support of developing seaweed businesses, is to go out and try and put a little bit of seaweed into your life every day. And that will be good for your long-term wellness, as well as supporting the industries that are emerging and will make a difference. So that's the very first thing you can do today or tomorrow, is to go out and make that choice. And then it's about continuing to learn yourself. We've tried to make it easy for people at this starting point by putting seaweed into food that we would eat every day, like pasta. It means that if we put 10% seaweed in this pasta and someone cooks spaghetti bolognese, which is the national dish of Australia, cooked most nights of the week, then we have already got seaweed into the diet. Tick one. And then after that, it's going to be about exploring and teaching people how to eat seaweed and cook with seaweed themselves, which is the ideal situation we would like to get to. But we have to be realistic, and people don't know what to do with it or where to get it. And so that's why we create these easy-to-use foods. And in the modern world as well, unfortunately, it's the reality that people want to have a quick solution, and they're not always in a position to forage and get the complete set of nutrients that they'd like to have. And also people on a very high plant-based diet, is very important that even, especially vegans, is that the complete set of nutrients is accessible to them. And that's where our focus is on putting seaweeds, and with its B12, for example, into foods that are easy for a vegan to pick up and eat every day. So that's just step one. Start putting seaweed into your life every day. And then learning about and just supporting the industries that you think make a change for the planet, just like buying solar panels. And when you do start to see local seaweed producers and farms turning up, support the local food production there. It's a little bit difficult. People ask me, a little bit like a cottage garden, can I grow seaweed at home? Well, you can, but you sort of need a seawater system. And then you've got to cart buckets of seawater up, and then you've got to know the reproductive life cycle of seaweeds. So it's not as easy as people might like to think. But, alongside some of the oyster industries where there's oyster leases, that's a great place to start collaborating with a local oyster farmer, for example, and look at what seaweeds are growing on the oyster leases and what you could grow around there. Those are sort of little things that people can do each day. But I think the most important thing is to start just getting a bit of seaweed in your diet every day for your own sake and for the planet's sake.
Special thanks to our sound engineer and musician, Shannon Soul Carroll, and artist-in-residence, Chris Miyashiro. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my co-host, Dave Rastovich, thanks for listening with us. Learn more about all of our Watershed Chats guests on Instagram at Water People Podcasts. You can listen to every episode and find some extras on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.